So my name again is John Root. I'm the founder of a company called Perceptual, and fundamentally we do two things. One of them is we help organizations implement systems of AI governance, and we're going to talk today about what that means. So I don't expect everyone on the conversation today to know exactly what that is. That's one of the things that we're going to learn today. The other thing that we do is training and certification in the world of AI governance, AI literacy, and AI safety. So organizations will hire us to come in and help them figure out how to roll out AI safely throughout their organization. I also teach this material at Michigan State University and at the University of Chicago. So here's what we hear all the time in our client work here at the beginning of 2026. So the CEO says, the board says that we need AI governance and our customers demand it, but we're in a hiring freeze, so we can't hire more people to do AI governance. We don't have a bunch of money for expensive consultants like me, I suppose. That's something I certainly hear. And this is something that we need like yesterday. Like our customers are already asking for it. Our board is already asking for it. So the people that, that I talk to now here in early 2026 are feeling a lot of push by their higher ups, by the market, and by their legal counsel oftentimes to get AI governance done and to get it done correctly. So today we're going to talk about a 90-day time frame for enabling AI governance in the organization. We're going to walk through that time frame. But before we get into that, I wanted to say, why are we talking about 90 days? Why 90 days? Why not 180? Why not 30? Whatever. First of all, and most importantly, I think, this is, I think, the minimum viable timeline that allows organizations of any size really to put basic governance structures and staffing in place. I think that you really just can't do it in less time than this. There are some elements of AI governance that you could do in 90 days. So you could write an AI use policy, for example, which controls how your employees use AI in less than 90 days. Like that's probably a 30-day sprint. But to really have a full system, I think this is the least amount of time that works. Secondly, we want to make sure that we are policy ready with our AI governance. So the policies that we generate, the procedures that we generate have to be circulated throughout the organization, and we have to be able to train our workforce on those policies. Simply writing policies, as we will see today, is not enough. And then I think that this is also a set of work which is doable from folks that are coming from another discipline who have to learn on the job. One of the things I want to make sure to communicate today, no one listening to this, other than probably other than me, I think, is working full time in the field of AI governance. Instead, we're coming from other fields, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we're trying to figure out how to bolt on AI governance to the skills that we already have. I think that takes 90 days, right? That's not something where you can just do it overnight. Now, that said, I do think that it takes more than 90 days for most organizations ultimately. So I think 90 days is optimistic. And if you are running a very large organization with tens of thousands of employees, especially in a high risk or highly regulated industry like healthcare, education, finance, banking, infrastructure, it's probably going to take longer than this. So the presentation that I designed today is most helpful, I think, for the folks in a couple different situations. And ultimately, I won't read through all these. The idea that I want you to take away is, again, most people who are working in AI governance today did not start their career in AI governance because that's impossible, right? This is a field that is essentially new in the last couple of years. Now, of course, governance of technology systems, of quality systems, none of that is new. But this particular spin on management systems certainly is. I find that most people who are interested in going into AI governance are coming from information security, from privacy, oftentimes from HR, oftentimes consultants looking to offer this to their clients. We have a lot of attorneys in our training programs, certification programs, and then just a lot of people that are asked to figure this out in their organization from a variety of different backgrounds. So let's jump right in and talk about what AI governance is. So at the most high level, AI governance refers to the framework of policies, regulations, and practices that are designed to ensure ethical, transparent, and accountable development and deployment of AI. So I read that right off the slide. That's kind of my dictionary definition. Fundamentally, governance is those four things that you see on the slide. So it's an organization's principles, values, and goals translated into the language of AI control, right? So most organizations have, values, principles. Most organizations have, things that they're trying to accomplish out in the world, in the market. So how those get translated into how we use AI. Governance always includes risk management. That's a concept that's probably familiar to folks that are coming from InfoSec. Folks coming from other backgrounds might not be as familiar, so we'll define that term as we go. AI governance is policies and procedures, and importantly, especially for the folks here coming from the HR world, governance includes ongoing training. You can't have a governance program that is just a set of policies that live in a drawer or in a set of Google Docs or whatever. They have to actually make it into the organization. So I said at the beginning, I had that example, like the CEO says, we got to do governance. Why do we have to do governance? Well, there's three factors that we hear out in the field for why organizations now here at the beginning of 2026 want to invest in AI governance. The first, and honestly the most important in terms of what I actually hear in the field, is market factors. What we mean by that is enterprise customers are starting to require robust systems of AI governance. If you spent any time in enterprise sales or in InfoSec or privacy, you're used to getting from folks that you're trying to sell into a big questionnaire back on your policies, your procedures, asks if you have your SOC 2, et cetera, et cetera. At the top of those now is AI governance. So organizations that are trying to sell into enterprise, into highly regulated industries, into large organizations, into governments, all of those organizations are requiring from their vendors robust systems of AI governance. And this oftentimes what we see is there's often sort of this responsibility dump onto the vendors. So organizations understand that they're responsible for their own AI risk and their own AI risk in terms of what the government is going to make them do, like what the regulations are going to say. And oftentimes that's going to get pushed onto the vendor itself. So that kind of brings me to the second factor, which is the regulatory factors. All across the world, at every level of government, literally from like supranational institutions like the UN through intergovernmental coalitions like the European Union, national governments like the United States, state governments, counties I've seen, and even local municipalities have regulations around the use of AI. Now, it's not very feasible to track all of those. I don't think that most people are going to have to. Like that's my job. But the big ones that we see are, first of all, the EU AI Act. So if you're listening to this, you're like, well, we're here in the United States. Like, we don't have a big market in Europe. Do we care about that? The same way that every website now that you ever go to has that cookie disclosure warning, that's an artifact from the European Union's GDPR. And what we saw in that rollout was the European Union passed a set of regulations and made it very broadly applicable. And that's the exact same thing that's happening with the EU AI Act. So you may not be located in the EU. I'm not located in the EU. But if you are selling into European organizations, European companies, or even European customers, the EU AI Act does technically apply to you. So lots of organizations are working to comply with this regulation, even if they're located here in the US where I am. There's lots of state-by-state regulation in the US. The biggest and most important regulations are in California, Colorado, Texas, and Illinois. One thing that you see there that might stand out is, kind of like if we think about our, American political landscape, one of those things is not like the other, right? So Texas kind of stands out as a state that you don't think about as like highly regulation, and I think that's normally true. Texas's AI regulation has kind of a government spin on it. So instead of trying to control or limit the use of AI by companies, Texas's law it controls and limits the use of AI primarily by government entities. Now that said, if you're a private organization and you're selling into Texas, there's elements of this that's going to apply to you. So we have to keep track of those. We're also going to see lots of industry-specific regulations. So, for example, in the education industry, there's lots of regulations at the state level or sometimes at the local or school district level around the use of data of children, which there certainly should be. Thank God that these regulations do exist, but you have to make sure you're keeping track of those. And then finally, the last factor is the internal factors in the organization. So things like internal security requirements, things like how shadow AI is being tracked and mitigated throughout the organization. If you haven't heard of that term, that's like one of the new words from 2025. Shadow AI means the use of AI by employees in your organization that is either in the absence of a formal AI policy or against the formal AI policy. It's a huge issue in information security right now. And then finally, pressure from the board, pressure pressure from investors. I do think that the way you see this on the slide here, market, regulatory, and internal, is the order that I see these importance in the market. When I first started in this sort of work about 5 years ago, I thought regulatory was going to be like the big one, right? There's a law, everyone has to follow the law. It turns out it's not quite so simple. What usually pushes organizations to invest significant time, resources, and money into AI governance is those market factors. So you were interested in AI governance. Let's think about, what does that actually mean for us as people who are going to be responsible for this? I always show this slide because I want to make sure to communicate to you, if you're listening, that AI governance is not like something that anyone studied in school. I actually have partnered with Michigan State University, and we've launched literally the first university-sponsored AI certification program, AI governance certification program in the entire world. Before this, like before literally last month, this didn't exist, right? There's no school that you go to for AI governance. No one majors in it. There's not even like master's degrees in it yet. And so I say that because if you're thinking about getting into this industry, like you're in this call because you're interested in this, folks usually come from one of these three backgrounds. So either you come from sort of a technical background, you actually know how to program AI systems, you write in Python. That's not me, by the way. I'm not in that circle at all. Many people come from a policy or legal background. This includes, information security professionals, privacy professionals, then a lot of attorneys, a lot of kind of like policy folks. And then the last circle is what I call cat wrangling. And sometimes people say I could think of a nicer way to say this, but fundamentally what I mean by that is the work of AI governance is about having all these different moving parts throughout a big organization. Even a medium organization has lots of moving parts. There's different people, departments. The human resources department wants one thing from AI. The sales team wants a different thing. The information security team wants a different thing. And the work of the AI governance professional is getting all those parts of the organization together to create one uniform set of policies that everyone can follow. That's social skills, right? That is that's organizational skills. You might say that's political skills. And the space of the folks that are in the Venn diagram middle that have all of those things entering this space is essentially no one, right? I didn't have all three of those sets of skills when I started in professional AI governance work. And so the message again is, if you're thinking about getting into this kind of work, you don't need to be technical, right? And fundamentally, that's the biggest misconception that we have in the field, is that you have to be an AI expert. You have to be coming from like Google or OpenAI to do this work. That's just not true at all. Most people come from, I would say, the policy or legal world. So if we're talking about AI governance, what is different about AI governance from what organizations are already doing in terms of things like information security or privacy? Well, a lot of it transfers from InfoSec, that means information security. So thinking about different risks, thinking about the different controls in the organization, and we'll talk about what a control is, mapping those controls, developing policies, et cetera. So that stuff transfers pretty well from the information security world. But there's a lot of things that are very new in the world of AI governance. One of them is that the system itself is the risk, right? So in the world of cybersecurity, we think like we've got our internal systems and there's going to be like an attack from the outside, right? So we're going to get like hacked or whatever, and that's the potential harm. But in the world of AI governance, it's the actual workings of the AI system that we're looking to protect. Yes, the AI system can also be hacked. That's also a risk, but it's a bigger set of risks. Secondly, and this is a really critical point, the outputs of AI systems are probabilistic. That means that if something happens with your AI system, that's sort of the way it was designed, right? So when we think about things like, AI outputs that are, potentially problematic, that's sort of innate in the world of AI systems where you don't get the same response every time. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to govern AI systems. In AI governance, the stakeholder set is much larger. What I mean by that is when we do professional AI governance work, we are required by the frameworks and regulations that we are trying to apply in organizations to do what's called a stakeholder analysis. And that's looking at every level of the AI value chain from, maybe we make AI systems, maybe we deploy AI systems, but we're looking at the maker of the system, the deployer of the system, the intermediaries, and ultimately, like most importantly, the actual people that are affected affected by AI systems. When we talk about things like, like information security or it's like we don't want to get hacked, like that's bad. But for AI, I think it's much more applicable to harms for actual people. And, we can talk about that all day. Like spend 10 minutes on LinkedIn, you'll see these horror stories about AI harming people. But that's the work that AI governance is there to mitigate and control. Compliance is a spectrum in the world of AI governance. What we mean by that is if we think about like the law, like think about, for example, our sexual harassment policy. I always use this example. In our sexual harassment policy in the workplace, we say, here's a thing that's bad. We're going to define it. We're going to ban it. And then we're going to punish the people that break the ban, right? That makes sense. That's all very logical. But in the world of AI, the compliance that we have with different frameworks and regulations, it's very much a lot of gray areas that we're navigating, right? So there's some things that you can't do with AI, right? So you can't, expose publicly identifiable information. You can't expose information about, children, for example. There are lots of protections, justifiably so. But as we think about, all the different harms or challenges with AI, there's a lot of gray areas in there that we're navigating. And then finally, I like this idea of non-technical judgment has to be required, right? So again, this is not like navigating firewalls and like doing Python code or whatever. We're thinking about things like ethics. I always use what I call the 3 cornerstone model of AI ethics, which is fairness, explainability, and transparency. Sometimes I call fairness bias prevention to give you an idea of kind of what the biggest issue is there. But that's kind of some of the ideas of why AI governance becomes so challenging. So let's jump in and start talking about this actual work of AI governance, right? We had some introductory thoughts. Let's talk about what does this actually mean when we talk about AI governance? Well, fundamentally, the work of AI governance is implementing usually one of a number of frameworks that already exist that other people have written. 2 of the biggest ones are the National Institute of Standards and Technology AI Risk Management Framework. That's a big mouthful. So we call it the NIST AI RMF. You see there on the left side of the screen. On the right side is a different standard, which is called ISO 42001. The NIST standard is more kind of like the US standard. The ISO standard is more global. The NIST standard is voluntary, so organizations can just put it in place and do it. The ISO standard requires verification by a third-party auditor. So, I mentioned those 2 because we're not going to have time today to really jump in and talk about all the differences. But fundamentally, if you are assigned AI governance in your organization, you're not starting from scratch, right? So you're not like starting with a blank piece of paper and thinking like, oh, well, geez, like let's, make a list of all the bad things that AI could do. Instead, we're generally starting with one of these frameworks. That's, I think, good news, right? That makes it a much more predictable process and a much more kind of approachable process for folks coming from other industries, which again is everybody. Now, one of the things that I do is, I spend a lot of time researching and I've, follow all these people on LinkedIn about AI governance. And every week there's a new AI governance frameworks. And you can expect that every week there will be more. There'll be dozens and dozens of frameworks. Every government in the world will have their own framework. Universities will have one. Random nonprofits that you've never heard of will have one. Every industry association will have one. Fundamentally, you could ignore most of those unless they really become an industry standard. And the only place where I've seen that happen so far is in the finance and fintech world. Now, maybe there'll be one for healthcare. Now, obviously, when we talk about AI governance, like we're not ignoring other regulations, right? So if you're in healthcare, HIPAA is still a really important thing. That's going to become part of how you think about AI governance in your system. But, still fundamentally, going back a slide, we're implementing probably one of these 2 frameworks with some customization for our industry and our use case. So that said, one of the things that we do as AI governance professionals is think about creating the right size governance for the right organization. So this is going to depend on a lot of different things. So our industry, some industries are more highly regulated than others, right? So again, healthcare, education, finance, banking, insurance, infrastructure, et cetera. Those are much more highly regulated than like, you're a local plumbing company. You've got much less need for protection from AI challenges. The use case of AI matters a lot. So not only our industry, but how we're using AI, where we are in the value chain. So there's certain regulations and frameworks that apply more to the makers of AI systems compared with the what we call deployers of AI systems. Where you are in the organizational life cycle, that's a really fancy way of saying big companies need more of this than little companies. Every day, like I've worked with, global top 50 conglomerates, which are, massive organizations, and I've worked with startups, and they just need different things. And then finally, your customer base. So sometimes you're in an industry where you're selling into highly regulated industries, or you're selling into government, for example, and you probably need your AI governance more kind of like tightly wound than you might need if you were selling into a less regulated industry. So that said, if we're thinking about what our organization actually needs in terms of AI governance, one of the key ways that we think about this is this concept of risk management. And risk management is at the absolute core of what we do as AI governance professionals. So risk management is identifying, assessing, and mitigating the risks that are associated with AI. So what are the things that we have to do? You can see those numbers on the slide. First of all, we identify what the risks of harm are. And we think about them on, again, that's wide range of stakeholders, right? So it's not just, what are the risks of AI like for our company? It's what are the risks of AI for our customers, and then ultimately for the people that use our systems. Secondly, we prioritize those tasks by understanding the likelihood of the harm occurring and the impact of the harm if it actually happens, right? So, of course, we would prioritize higher a harm that's very likely versus one that's not so likely, and we prioritize higher harm that like has like actual harm to people. So, for example, if we're in the mortgage industry, which we've worked in, if you are denying people for a mortgage, like that like really impacts people's lives. Or in healthcare, obviously, like if you have a diagnosis and you mess with the diagnosis, like that's very bad for a person. So there's much more risk involved there. And then number three, we use a toolbox of remediation techniques on that risk, and then we monitor the results, right? So we identify the risks, then we think, how can we reduce this risk? So we use techniques like, for example, having ongoing auditing of AI systems, for example, for fairness or bias. Or we put a human in the loop, right? So if we have a system that's evaluating mortgages, if we deny mortgages to people in sort of a borderline case, we'll put a human in there to look at those borderline cases and make the final approval, right? So those are the ways that we kind of, are some examples of the ways that we mitigate risk. Work fundamentally is about moving from what we call controls to policies. So what is a control? Well, a control is usually a very brief statement about what do we have to do to implement AI safely in a very specific way. So for example, we might have a control that says anytime we're making a decision on a real human being, we have a human in the loop in that process, right? So that's an example of a control. You might remember back to those frameworks that I talked about, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework and ISO 42001. Those are fundamentally lists of controls, right? And there's a lot of other stuff in there and a lot of great background reading, whatever. Fundamentally, we're picking out the controls in those policies, and there's dozens of them. Now, an organization won't just take one of those frameworks off the shelf. They're also thinking about their context. So for example, again, I'd mentioned HIPAA in the health context. A health organization will add HIPAA controls to their list of controls for AI governance. A financial institution will add actually all sorts of controls over banking information. Generically, many organizations add controls around the use of personal identifiable information. So fundamentally, we start with our frameworks and our regulations. We develop a list of controls. Then we create a list of policies. And policies is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a Word document or a Google document that lays out how do we actually put those controls into effect in our organization. So we'll have a policy somewhere that says in our organization, anytime an AI makes a decision about a real human being that has the potential to cause harm, that decision will be reviewed by a human in the loop, right? That'll actually be in a policy. Oftentimes policies are between, I would say, 3 and 50 pages for a big organization. Lots of time is spent putting those into effect. And then, fundamentally, we have our to-dos that come from those policies. If we don't do that, right, if we don't have a list of how we actually put these policies into effect in our organization, it's not really worth that much of an effort in our organization to do it. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. There's a couple detail slides here that you'll find in the slide deck as well, if you'd like to look at that afterwards. We're also doing the work of mitigating risks in the world of AI governance. So, I mentioned this a little bit previously, but there's always residual risk in AI systems. There's no AI system that I've ever seen that is completely risk-free. So we're thinking about if there's a serious risk of an AI system causing real harm, we have to think about how do we mitigate that. Now, we do that, we mitigate the risk. Sometimes there's residual risk after we do that, and then the organization has to determine if that level of risk is acceptable or not. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Now, the good thing about this is that the AI governance professional, we're not doing that alone, right? So we're establishing a team around us for AI governance. And this is actually required by a number of the regulations and frameworks. So when we put together a governance team, first of all, it's a couple people from different parts of the organization. There's always people that are not technical, who don't have the job of actually making the AI systems. That's actually a requirement in a number of the frameworks that we work in. Usually what we'll have when we establish the governance teams, we'll have like a AI steering committee at a big organization, maybe that's led by the CIO, the CISO, chief AI officer, if there is one. At a medium-sized organization, usually the CEO will sit on that committee, oftentimes a board member, oftentimes someone from the HR department because they're in charge of training, and they're working together really to guide the governance implementation. So let's talk a little bit. We're going to go through this relatively quickly about this kind of core process of AI governance, and then we'll talk about this 90-day plan. So here's what I think of as like the very vastly oversimplified steps of AI governance. First, we're going to put the leadership in place. Then we're going to choose and list our frameworks and controls. Then we're going to draft our policies. We'll implement those policies and audit if necessary. And then we're going to review and revise those policies over time. So let's break that out a little bit. First, when we talk about establishing leadership, every good AI governance system requires buy-in from the top of the organization. And the reason this is the case is because we're really making choices that affect how the organization functions, the level of risk that we take on, both in terms of market risk, regulatory risk, data risk. And if we're not thinking about that in terms of the entire organization, it's going to be a real challenge. AI governance is not easy. This is a multi-month process that takes real money, real time from lots of people. So we have to have good governance buy-in from the top of the organization. Actually skip that one. Governance, as I mentioned, is led by a steering committee. The steering committee usually is 3 to 7 members. And a little hint here is that the most successful steering committees are usually find ways of getting into the workflow that's already exists in the organization, right? So the senior people in an organization are already meeting on a regular basis to do the strategy review or a number of other things. So if you're able to put the AI steering committee into areas of time where it already exists, this goes much easier. One of the big challenges that I see for AI governance professionals is, they have to go to all of these executives in the organization, most of whom technically outrank them in the org chart and persuade them they should have to spend a lot of time on AI governance work. So try to make that easier as you roll this out throughout the organization. An AI governance lead ultimately manages the day-to-day of the governance system. And, for me, this is kind of one of the ways that I plug in terms of our consulting work, or folks from our firm will plug in and kind of do this. But one person ultimately is kind of like the key organizer of the AI governance system, and they're running the day-to-day. Oftentimes at a smaller organization, this is one person. At a big kind of enterprise, it's multiple people. They lead the agenda for that steering committee. They're ultimately responsible for drafting and updating those policies. And ultimately, they just make sure that the government system is actually happening, right? And that's actually a really key point. The biggest mistake that organizations make with AI governance is thinking this is a thing that we're going to kind of do once, and then it's just done, and we don't have to look at it anymore. But we're not doing that. We're putting into effect a system, right? And systems run continuously. And that's a challenge. That's why you need staffing for it. Great AI governance leads, in my experience, have some technical knowledge. They have some information security, some privacy experience. They have some policy or legal experience. Again, they rarely have all three. So don't be afraid to jump into this. The next phase of AI governance is we think about our frameworks and we think about our controls. So again, I want to make sure we're really clear on this. When I talk about frameworks, I'm talking about those structures like ISO 42001 and the NIST AI risk management framework, right? So these are, third-party frameworks that are put into place. There's no government that says you absolutely have to do it. That's what regulations are for, right? So regulations are laws passed by government that require compliance. These happen at every level, like we'd said, EU AI Act, Colorado, other states, municipalities, et cetera. And then the controls come from those frameworks and regulations, right? So a control is a part of the framework that ultimately defines a specific goal that the AI governance system has to meet. So here's some examples of those controls. I love to show examples because I want you to actually see what this work is. These are taken directly from the NIST AI risk management framework. That framework is totally free. So you Google AI, risk management framework, you can actually see what this system is all about. And so these are a couple of the controls. Like this is what, 5. There's probably 40 or 50. Here's one, point 1, test sets, metrics, and details about the tools used during TEVV, which is testing essentially, are documented, right? So when we do testing and evaluation of AI systems, the metrics and the details that we use are written down, right? So we're already doing testing for sure. We just need a system for actually writing it down. That's a control. Now, the controls ultimately flow together. So we talked about frameworks, we talked about regulations. One of the things that we do in AI governance is kind of bring all that list of controls together and deduplicate those, right? So we say, okay, NIST AI risk management framework says we have to do these things. EU AI Act says we have to do this other thing. How do we combine those and make a list that's a little bit more manageable? Then we start to bucket it into policies. So we don't have different policy for every control. Like most organizations have probably 100 plus controls for AI governance. So we create a relatively short list of policies, and this is what those core policies look like. So AI management policy, AI usage and monitoring, transparency and reporting, data management, roles and responsibilities, etc. Some organizations, if you're a larger organization especially, you'll break these out into separate policies. Some organizations will combine these into 1 or 2 or 3 policies where they're doing a lot of different things. But policies fundamentally, again, are just Word documents or Google documents, right? There's a little example there on the left side, so we won't read it, but you see this is written in plain English, right? It's designed to be read by actual people and actually put into place within the organization. Then we have these policies and we actually have to put them into work in the organization. This is really the hard part. And so I think people getting started with AI governance think, oh, the hard part is going to be like figuring out the controls. No, the hard part is actually doing this work. So when we implement our AI governance system, we have to do frontline training. So we have to train our entire workforce and what their responsibilities are in our government system. We'll have training for our managers and our functional leaders, head of sales, chief marketing officer, et cetera. And then we'll also have training for the AI steering committee and oftentimes for the board as well. So if you're coming from the HR world, there's a lot of training. The worst government systems, I've said this before, but I really want to highlight this point, are those that are developed in a hurry to pass an audit or to pass, a screener for a certain customer and then forgotten about. But audits are important, right? And one of the most important things to know about auditing of these systems is that the system itself is what's being audited, right? So some people make the mistake of thinking, what's being audited is our policies. Like an auditor will look at your policies, and I'm a certified auditor for AI systems. An auditor will look at your policies for sure, but what an auditor is really looking for is the evidence that says that it's actually happening in your organization. As an example, all of the frameworks require ongoing training on the AI systems and dangers. And that's what we see on the top of this slide. So we have a policy that says, well, we're going to train our people. Here's how we're going to do it. What the auditor is looking for is not that you said that you would do it, but like, where is the list that says that, Susie from the marketing team was actually in attendance at this AI training session, right? Like, show me the evidence that the people that you say you're training, you're actually training. We also always have what's called a gap assessment. A gap assessment is the space between what we say we're going to do in our policies and what is actually happening. Now, every single company in the entire world who's ever done AI governance has a gap, right? So this is not like you're doing something wrong. This is just like we're saying we're going to make some changes. What are the very specific places where we're going to make those changes? So a gap assessment will say, here's where we're trying to get to, defined by our controls. Here's where we are now. Here's the mitigation plan to get us there. And importantly, who owns that change and who owns that timeline? There's lots of responsibility of ownership that happens with AI governance. So finally, AI governance systems and policies are not one point in time. The biggest mistake, again, is like we're not putting in place a system for passing one audit. We're putting in place a system that happens over time. And over time, the systems and the policies get edited, right? So the steering committee should be meeting on at least a quarterly basis to discuss changes to the AI policies. Continuous improvement is a phrase that you hear a lot in the world of AI governance and in the world of kind of management systems generally. It's a really bedrock part of systems like ISO 42001, and your auditor is looking for evidence of this, right? So again, it's not enough just to say like, oh, we're going to revise this. You have to show in the minutes of a meeting that the organization actually talked about changes and improvements to the system if you want to get credit from that from an auditor. Okay. Let's talk briefly about this 90-day plan. This is going to be extremely high level. So again, this is not the detailed part of the discussion. If we actually when we do this work for clients, there's like dozens and dozens of to-dos. We're not going to go into that detail today, but fundamentally, I want you to understand what this looks like. So in the first 15 days of an AI governance project, we're trying to understand the organizational landscape. So first of all, what's our mandate? What is the board and the CEO and the executives think that we're actually doing with AI governance? What do we have permission to do? Then we start with a registry of AI systems. This is a really critical component because if you don't know what AI is in use in your organization, it's going to be really, really difficult to actually govern AI in any sort of responsible way. So we start to list those systems out. It's harder than it sounds. Then we're scheduling interviews with functional leaders. We need to talk to everyone in the organization who's managing large teams about how they're using AI, what they're seeing, what they're developing, what the challenges are. Because again, one of the big things that you're doing as an AI governance professional is creating leadership throughout the organization on these issues. And that means creating relationships, right? So when we talked about cat herding, you saw that Venn diagram. This is the cat herding part, right? We have to figure out how are we going to take what IT wants, what sales wants, what HR wants, what privacy wants, and put it into one system. And we do that by talking to those parties. The next 2 weeks, we continue to build those relationships and we start to create our first policies. So we're interviewing those functional leaders about AI. We want to make sure that we are meeting with our CFO to figure out what AI systems are we actually paying for. This is really an important part of it because a lot of the challenges with AI use and a lot of the shadow AI in the organization comes from people not buying $500,000 AI instances, but from people putting like $20 a month AI SaaS products on a company card, right? Which doesn't go to the CFO. So we have to make sure that we are kind of like scanning all of our expenses to make sure we're figuring those things out. I think that the first policy to create is an internal AI use policy. That's the policy that governs how we use AI in our own organization. And that can be kind of like an early first win that you can create as an AI governance professional. Then we want to start understanding the organizational dynamics around our AI steering committee. Who wants to be on it? Who thinks it's a big pain in the behind and they'd rather avoid it? Who are the most powerful voices on AI in the organization? We want to start to understand those dynamics from kind of a political standpoint. The next month, we are starting to move again from our regulations to our controls to our policies. So we have to get buy-in from our senior management on our initial list of frameworks and policies. So we say, we want to be compliant with major US state regulations, and we're going to implement the NIST AI risk management framework, which is a very, I think, kind of like common and vanilla way to start with AI governance. We put together our source of truth for our controls, our final control list. We map those to policies. We start to draft our core policies. I think the AI management policy is the second one to make after the use policy. That's really the core policy that talks through, from a high level strategically, what are we trying to do with AI governance? Who are the people that govern it? What is it? Who's on our steering committee? How does the steering committee work? Very fundamental policy. And then we're also starting to develop our third-party vendor questionnaires. The way that AI gets into most organizations is not because like we're building like brand new AI systems internally, unless we're like OpenAI or Google. But if we run like a big accounting firm or we run a big construction company, right? We're buying AI from our vendors. So we want to start thinking about what questions to ask them. In this final month, we're starting to do our risk assessments and starting to get our policies approved. So again, for us as the AI governance leader, generally we're not the CEO, right? So we need to start getting approvals on the policies that we're drafting. And we want to start working on our formal risk management assessments of our biggest AI systems, right? So again, risk management is a critical concept. If our AI systems are creating harm, we need mitigation plans. So we start to do that work. And then we also start to create our initial gap assessment, right? So again, we're creating policies. The policies are going to be different from what's happening in the organization today. The gap assessment is that space in the middle, and we want to start making that list. Then finally, on our 90th day, I think we can convene our AI steering committee, right? So we review and approve our draft policies. We review and approve our list of existing AI systems and their use cases. We talk about our training schedule. Hopefully we're able to get some budget for our training. And we outline what the steering committee is responsible for going forward. So of course, it doesn't end on day 90, right? So it's not day 90 and done. I hope I've communicated to that already. But from then we start to move into kind of like the more like steady state work of AI governance. So we are approving new AI use cases or disapproving them as the situation may be. We think about our escalation and incident tracking, right? So when there's a violation of our policies, we want to make sure we know about it and can work on it. We maintain AI systems, and as you see on the right side there, we're rolling out training. Like training happens at different levels. Training on AI safety and governance is not like a 60-minute all hands training. It's not, I say this to people all the time. If you're getting your AI safety and governance training from the same vendor that you're getting your forklift safety certification training from, it's not good, right? Like that's just not the way to go about that. And what we want to make sure we're doing, you see at the bottom there, is on day 91 and then like forever after that, we have to make sure we're creating what we call artifacts, that the system is actually being used, not just policy in a drawer somewhere, right? So this is what auditors are looking for. So make sure we show who's actually going to training. If we say our steering committee met, we have to make sure that we have the minutes and the agenda from that discussion, etc. So one more thing, and then we'll talk about our big priorities and takeaways. The most common mistakes that people make, and I've said a number of these, but really critical things to make sure we understand. The biggest mistake is creating a point-in-time system, right? AI governance is not a point-in-time system. Sometimes people, we do this 90-day sprint for companies all the time in our paid client work. And the first thing I say when we do our sales calls or our scoping calls with new customers is we say, we're going to get you started in 90 days, right? So this is not 90 days and then we quit. This is 90 days and then we keep going. Building for the auditor, not the organization, is a big problem, right? Remember, these policies have to actually be put in place. So if you say in your policies like, oh, we're going to like ban AI for the sales team, but the sales team is actually like using the AI every day, like that's a really bad situation. Skipping inventory assessment is a big mistake. There's no way to govern AI if you don't know what's in use in your organization. A lack of an executive sponsor is a big problem. So if you are going into an organization as a AI governance professional, but your CEO doesn't like care, that's a really bad place to be. It's not going to work. Policies without training is a big mistake. So again, if you're not telling your organization how to use these things and familiarizing everyone in the organization all the way down the org chart with their responsibilities, it's not going to work. Not building cross-functional bridges. What I mean by that is, remember we talked about cat herding a little bit. If you as the AI governance professional don't have a good relationship with the other key players on your AI steering committee and across the organization, you will fail because, and this goes to the last one of the biggest personal risks of an AI governance professional is getting this reputation as what we call Dr. No, right? And you can probably figure out what that means. Dr. No is the person that says like, well, you can't do that with AI and that's not ethical and et cetera, et cetera. And we really have to lock this down. That person is unpopular in most organizations and their tenure tends to be relatively limited, right? So look, sometimes we have to say no to AI systems. If an AI system is harming people out in the real world, like we don't want that. But the real work of AI governance is not to say like, here's what's a yes and here's what's a no. It's to say we are thinking about different risks at different times in different contexts and industries. That's what's challenging, and that's why I think also so fun about this work and this profession. So, what do I think are some of the top priorities for AI governance moving forward? First of all, you have to have senior management buy-in. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, okay, I'd like some of this in my organization, like how do I do it? If you don't have that senior level buy-in, like it's just not gonna work, right? So you have to make sure that the board or the ownership and the senior management are on your side for AI governance. Second, we want to be thinking about investing in the right level of AI governance. So it's sort of related to the first point, because if we go to our CEO and say, hey, we make like wooden toys, and so what we need is a $500,000 AI governance consulting engagement, and we need to develop like 400 pages of policies, and we're going to need a team of 45 people to do it. Like that's not going to work, right? That sounds like totally crazy. On the flip side, right, we can't if we're like United Healthcare, highly regulated, large industry, where the impact of our AI systems affects actual people in like a potentially like lethal way. They need a big AI governance system, right? So the right level for the right organization, and then finally, making sure that we're training down the org chart, right? So if we're coming from, especially from our HR or training background, how do we take, AI ethics, AI responsibility, the policies that we agree on, the challenges that AI poses in our organization, and make sure that that's going all the way down the org chart. Okay, hopefully that is beneficial. Just a couple other thoughts. I'd love to keep in touch with folks. There's my email. We're at perceptual.com. We help organizations roll out this 90-day start to AI governance all the time. We also provide safety, literacy, and productivity training related to the use of AI. We've also launched, I mentioned this, the world's first certification for AI governance that is through and certified by a major university. So we work with Michigan State University's Broad College of Business to issue this certification in AI governance.